April 6, 1945. Off Okinawa, the sky is just beginning to pale. On radar picket destroyers scattered miles ahead of the American fleet, sailors stare into glowing green scopes. The night has been quiet, too quiet. Then the screens begin to fill. At first, a handful of blips, then more, then dozens. Within minutes, the operators understand the truth. This is not a routine contact. This is not a raid. It is a flood. Inside the combat information centers, voices sharpen, bearings are called out, distances close fast. The contacts are coming from multiple directions, low and high, spreading wide across the horizon. Someone counts aloud and stops when the numbers no longer make sense. Hundreds of aircraft are approaching. On deck, 5-inch gun crews move into position. Shells are hauled from lockers and slammed into open breaches. Some of them carry unfamiliar markings stenciled onto their steel casings. 2 letters most sailors have barely heard explained. VT. No one pauses to discuss what they mean. There isn't time. As dawn breaks, the sound reaches the ships before the planes are visible. A low, distant vibration, the combined drone of engines pushing toward the fleet in disciplined waves, pilots sealed inside cockpits, flying aircraft loaded not for return but for impact. These are not conventional attacks. Every man on deck knows it. The radar pickets were placed here for a reason: to see first, to bleed first, to buy time for the ships behind them. Orders are passed, guns elevate, firing solutions lock in. At exactly 600 hours, the first aircraft break through the morning haze. The American fleet opens fire. Black bursts begin appearing in the sky, too precise, too well-timed, blooming not where the planes were, but where they are about to be. Something has changed in the air above Okinawa, and no one watching that sky, American or Japanese, yet understands how completely this morning will decide what survives the day. To understand, 2, why the Kamikaze terrified the American fleet, you have to understand the moment Japan found itself in. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken in ways that numbers alone could not fix. Its carrier air groups had been shattered. Most of its veteran pilots, the men who had trained for years, who had mastered formation flying and carrier landings, were gone. They had been lost over the Marianas, over the Philippine Sea, in battles Japan could not replace. What remained were aircraft without carriers, fuel without time, and young pilots with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. Conventional attacks no longer worked. American ships were surrounded by radar, fighter cover, and layers of anti-aircraft fire. Bombers were intercepted long before they reached release range. Torpedoes missed or were dodged. For every Japanese aircraft launched, only a few ever came close enough to matter. So Japan made a calculation. If accuracy could not be achieved through skill, it would be achieved through certainty. The Kamikaze was not born from blind fanaticism alone. It was a cold, desperate solution to a mathematical problem. A pilot who did not need to escape could aim longer, fly lower, and commit fully to the attack. A single aircraft, carrying a single bomb, could do what entire squadrons now failed to accomplish. And at first, it worked. During the fighting in the Philippines, kamikaze attacks struck American ships with shocking frequency. Escort carriers burned, destroyers were torn open, hit rates soared far beyond anything achieved by conventional air attacks. 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 impact. The exchange was brutally efficient. The men chosen for these missions were often barely trained. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time. They were taught basic navigation, ship recognition, and the final dive. The rest of the preparation was spiritual. Pilots wrote farewell letters. They shared final cups of sake. They were given headbands, sometimes swords, symbols meant to turn fear into resolve. They were told that their sacrifice would change the course of the war. From the American perspective, the kamikaze felt unstoppable. How do you deter an attacker who does not intend to survive? How do you defend against a weapon guided by a human being willing to die? By early 1945, many officers believed there was no perfect answer, only endurance. But what worked in the Philippines would face something entirely different in the skies over Okinawa. Because while Japan had turned pilots into weapons, the United States had quietly turned shells into something else entirely. And this time, the mathematics would not favor sacrifice. While Japanese pilots were being trained to die with their aircraft, the United States Navy had been fighting a very different war, one fought in laboratories, factories, and quiet briefing rooms far from the front. It began with a simple, almost impossible idea. What if an anti-aircraft shell did not need to hit an airplane to destroy it? What if it only needed to come close? For decades, naval gunners had relied on time-fused ammunition. Crews estimated an aircraft's range and speed, set a mechanical fuse, and hoped the shell would explode at just the right moment. Too early, and the burst was harmless. Too late, and the plane flew on untouched. Against fast-diving aircraft, the margin for error was razor-thin. The new American solution was something entirely different. Inside the nose of certain 5-inch shells was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, an electronic device small enough to fit inside a projectile, yet rugged enough to survive being fired from a naval gun. Once airborne, the shell continuously sent out radio waves. When those waves reflected off a nearby aircraft and returned at a shifted frequency, the shell knew it was close, and it detonated itself. No manual fuse setting, no perfect aim required. The shell decided when to explode. The concept sounded elegant. In practice, it was almost impossible. When a 5-inch gun fired, the shell experienced forces more than 20,000 times the force of gravity. It spun at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. Any fragile component inside should have shattered instantly. Engineers were told it could not be done. They did it anyway. Vacuum tubes were redesigned to survive shock. Batteries were created that activated only after firing. Every component had to function perfectly for just a few seconds, long enough to find a target and explode. If it failed, the shell was useless. And there was another problem. If the enemy recovered even one unexploded fuse, the secret would be exposed. Early in the war, commanders feared the technology could be reverse-engineered. For months, proximity-fused shells were restricted, issued sparingly, and fired only when recovery was impossible. By 1945, those fears had faded. American industry had solved what others could not. Factories across the United States began producing proximity fuses by the millions. Universities, private companies, and the Navy worked as a single system. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, the United States had manufactured enough of these devices to change doctrine itself. What had once been a rare experimental round now filled magazines across the fleet. By April 1945, most American warships carried proximity-fused shells as their primary defense against aircraft. Destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were no longer relying on luck and timing alone. They were building invisible walls in the sky. Still, no one truly knew how the weapon would perform against what was coming. Proximity fuses had been tested in combat. They had shot down individual aircraft. They had proven the idea worked. But Okinawa was different. No previous battle had thrown hundreds of suicide aircraft at the fleet in coordinated waves. No test had measured what would happen when human-guided weapons met shells that could think for themselves. On the morning of April 6, 1945, those questions would be answered in full view of the world. As the first kamikaze formations closed the distance, American gunners loaded their weapons with shells carrying invisible electronics instead of simple explosives. They aimed into empty sky and waited for the shells to decide when to kill. The Japanese called it Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, a name meant to sound poetic. What it delivered was annihilation. At 0600 on April 6, 1945, the first wave reached detection range. Radar operators tracked formations spreading wide, approaching from multiple axes at once. Navy aircraft, Army aircraft, fighters, bombers, older planes pressed back into service. Nearly 300 of them committed to suicide missions in a single coordinated assault. The picket destroyers opened fire at extreme range. 5-inch guns thundered in rapid sequence, their barrels recoiling again and again as shells climbed into the sky. From the decks below, the gunners could not see what was happening. From a distance, it looked wrong. The shells were not bursting behind the aircraft. They were not bursting ahead of them either. They were bursting beside them. Black clouds began appearing around the incoming planes, tight, perfectly timed detonations hanging in the air like markers. Aircraft flew into those clouds and vanished. Wings tore away. Fuselages broke apart. Engines spun free and fell toward the sea. Pilots who had expected to dodge tracer fire suddenly found themselves flying through a space that could not be seen or predicted. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern they could learn. A shell that missed by tens of feet now detonated as if guided. The effect was immediate. Entire attack formations began to unravel miles from the fleet. Planes were destroyed before they could descend to wave-top height. Others were damaged badly enough that they lost control and crashed short of their targets. Suicide missions were ending without impact, without even reaching the final dive. For American gunners, the difference was unmistakable. With conventional ammunition, anti-aircraft fire was a race against time. Crews had to estimate distance, set fuses, adjust, correct, and try again. Against fast maneuvering aircraft, those seconds mattered. Now they didn't. With proximity-fused shells, gun crews could engage immediately. There was no delay for fuse setting, no recalculation for every target. Guns tracked, fired, and shifted to the next aircraft in rapid succession. One shell, one chance, and if it came close enough, it killed. The sky above the picket line became layered with overlapping bursts, not a solid wall, but a shifting, three-dimensional field of lethal air. Japanese pilots flew into spaces that looked empty and found them filled with fragments moving faster than sound. Still, they kept coming. Some pilots pressed through the outer defenses. Some were hit but continued flying, engines burning, control surfaces shredded, momentum carrying them forward through sheer will and gravity. The Kamikaze did not stop because the odds worsened. They stopped only when the aircraft could no longer fly. And a few reached the ships. From the American perspective, this was the most terrifying part. Even as dozens of attackers were destroyed at range, others broke through the curtain of fire. Explosions slammed into hulls, decks burned, men were thrown across steel by concussions that came without warning. But something was undeniable. For the first time since the Kamikaze appeared, the majority of attackers were being destroyed before they could strike. Not intercepted by fighters, not deflected by last-second gunfire, but erased in the approach, farther out than Japanese planners believed possible. By mid-morning, the pattern was clear. The Kamikaze was still deadly, but it was no longer decisive. Above Okinawa, human-guided weapons were colliding with something entirely new, an invisible system that did not fear death, did not hesitate, and did not miss the way people did. The sky itself had turned against them. And this was only the first wave. One ship would come to embody the contradiction of Okinawa more than any other. USS Laffey was a Fletcher-class destroyer, fast, lightly armored, never designed to stand alone against massed air attack. On the morning of April 6th, she was stationed on radar picket duty, exposed far ahead of the main fleet, exactly where the Kamikaze pressure would be heaviest. At 0744, the attack focused on her. Aircraft came in low and fast, then high and diving, shifting angles as they closed. Within minutes, Laffey was under continuous assault. Her guns fired almost without pause, 5-inch mounts hammering skyward while smaller weapons stitched tracer fire across the approaches. Proximity-fused shells detonated around the incoming planes with lethal precision. Attacking aircraft disintegrated in midair. Others were shredded badly enough to veer off course and plunge into the sea. Gunners shifted targets instantly, no longer slowed by fuse settings or guesswork. In just over an hour, Laffey's crew fired hundreds of 5-inch rounds. 9 Kamikaze aircraft were destroyed outright by proximity-fused fire alone. And yet, it wasn't enough to stop them all. Some attackers forced their way through the exploding air. Damaged, burning, barely controllable, they kept coming. One after another, Kamikaze aircraft struck the ship. Explosions tore through the deck. Bombs penetrated deep inside the hull. Fires raged. Casualties mounted. At one point, Laffey was hit repeatedly in rapid succession, 6 suicide aircraft and multiple bombs slamming into her in less than 90 minutes. The destroyer was battered almost beyond recognition, her superstructure mangled, her deck littered with wreckage and wounded men. And still, she did not sink. Damage control teams fought fires by hand, dragging hoses through smoke and debris. Ammunition was passed despite the chaos. Gun crews stayed at their stations, firing until mounts were disabled, then moving to the next weapon that still worked. When the attack finally broke off, Laffey was alive, crippled, scorched, but afloat. The significance of her survival was not that proximity fuses made ships invulnerable. They did not. Laffey had been hit, men had been killed, steel had been torn apart. The significance was what didn't reach her. For every aircraft that struck Laffey, several more had been destroyed far out, their pilots never reaching the final dive. Without proximity-fused fire thinning the attack at distance, the destroyer would have faced dozens more impacts instead of a handful. The Kamikaze had proven they could still break through, but they could no longer overwhelm by numbers alone. USS Laffey survived not because the A threat was weak, but because it had been blunted before it arrived. And as battered as she was, other ships had learned the same lesson that morning. The key to survival was no longer just courage or luck or damage control. It was what happened to the attackers long before they ever saw the hull of their target. The proximity fuse did not arrive over Okinawa by accident. Its true debut had come more than 2 years earlier, in a very different battle, at a moment when the Pacific War still hung in the balance. January 1943. Near Guadalcanal. American ships were fighting to hold a fragile foothold in the Solomon Islands. The air was contested, the seas crowded with enemy aircraft probing constantly for weakness. At this stage of the war, every Japanese bomber that broke through still posed a deadly threat. Aboard the cruiser USS Helena, a 5-inch gun crew prepared to fire a weapon no one outside a handful of officers fully understood. The shell looked ordinary. What it carried inside was not. As a Japanese dive bomber closed in, the gun crew fired a short salvo. There was no direct hit, no dramatic impact. Instead, one of the shells passed close enough. It detonated beside the aircraft. The bomber disintegrated in midair, not because it had been struck, but because the shell had sensed its presence and chosen the moment to explode. Steel fragments tore through wings, engine, and cockpit in an instant. The pilot never reached his dive. For the men on Helena, the moment was unmistakable. They had just witnessed something no conventional anti-aircraft weapon could do. A plane destroyed without perfect aim, without perfect timing, without luck. That single engagement validated years of work that many had believed impossible. Inside the shell's nose were more than 100 tiny electronic components, miniature vacuum tubes, fragile wiring, a power source that activated only after firing. All of it had survived the violence of launch, the spin of the shell, and the chaos of flight long enough to function exactly as designed. It was proof. From that point on, proximity fuses were no longer theoretical. They were no longer experimental curiosities guarded in secrecy. They were weapons, quiet, invisible, and devastatingly effective. Their use expanded cautiously at first. Commanders feared capture. They limited firing to situations where shells would explode in midair or fall into deep water. But with every engagement, confidence grew. By the time American forces reached Okinawa in 1945, the proximity fuse was no longer a secret test. It was doctrine. What had begun with a single bomber over Guadalcanal had evolved into a system capable of reshaping the sky itself. And now, against the massed waves of Kikusui, the weapon that had proven itself in isolation would be measured at full scale, not by one aircraft, but by hundreds. As the Okinawa campaign dragged on, the chaos of battle began to resolve into patterns. After-action reports were compiled, ammunition expenditures were logged, engagements were reconstructed minute by minute. What emerged from those records was not just a story of courage or endurance, but a cold arithmetic of survival. With conventional time-fused ammunition, American ships had needed overwhelming volume to stop a single attacker. Hundreds of rounds were fired for every aircraft destroyed. Gun crews worked furiously to estimate range, reset fuses, correct errors, and try again, all while planes closed the distance at hundreds of miles per hour. Against kamikaze attacks, the margin was brutal. If one aircraft slipped through, it could kill dozens of sailors and cripple a ship in seconds. Proximity-fused shells changed that math entirely. Analysis conducted during and after the Okinawa campaign showed the difference with stark clarity. On average, it took more than 1,000 time-fused 5-inch shells to destroy a single kamikaze aircraft. With proximity-fused ammunition, that number dropped to roughly 300 rounds per kill. In some engagements, it was even lower. For destroyers stationed on radar picket duty, ships like USS Hugh W. Hadley or USS Aaron Ward, the effect was decisive. Their gun crews learned to fire continuous streams of proximity-fused shells ahead of incoming aircraft, not aiming for a single perfect burst, but creating overlapping zones of detonation that attackers had to fly through. Japanese pilots described it as a wall, not tracer fire, not flak drifting harmlessly behind them, but sudden explosions appearing exactly where their aircraft passed, shredding control surfaces, ripping open fuselages, killing pilots instantly or leaving planes uncontrollable. Even low-altitude tactics failed. Kamikaze pilots had been taught to skim the waves, approaching beneath radar coverage to reduce exposure. With proximity fuses, that advantage vanished. Shells detonated near the sea surface, their fragments spreading outward and upward, tearing through aircraft flying just meters above the water. There was no safe approach left. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical one. Pilots who survived aborted missions reported the same sensation again and again. Shells exploding with impossible accuracy, as if American gunners could see into the future. The sky itself felt hostile, unpredictable, lethal in ways no training had prepared them for. Japanese naval intelligence noticed the shift quickly. During earlier kamikaze operations, roughly 1 in 3 suicide aircraft had reached a target area. By late April 1945, that ratio had fallen sharply. Fewer than 1 in 4 reached effective attack range. The decline continued as American crews refined their techniques and coordination. Ships began firing in mutually supporting patterns, building layered defensive fields that overlapped and reinforced one another. Radar detection, fighter interception, and proximity-fused fire merged into a single system, each element buying time for the next. This was the true power of the proximity fuse. It did not make individual ships invulnerable. It made the entire fleet resilient. Every kamikaze destroyed at distance was not just one less impact. It was one less fire to fight, one less explosion to contain, one less cascade of damage that could overwhelm a ship's crew. Survival became less dependent on luck and more dependent on probability. And probability now favored the defenders. The kamikaze had been designed to exploit a simple truth, that no defense is perfect, that some attackers will always get through. The proximity fuse did not eliminate that truth, but it reduced it to a level that Japan could not sustain. As the numbers shifted, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a growing reality. Their pilots were still dying. Their aircraft were still being expended, but fewer and fewer American ships were being lost in return. The equation that had once justified sacrifice was beginning to break, and Japan would try, one last time, to change it. Japanese commanders were not blind to what was happening. Reports from surviving pilots told the same story again and again. Aircraft were being destroyed far earlier than expected. Approaches that had once worked, low, fast, straight in, were now death sentences. The sky ahead of the American fleet had become lethal long before a pilot could begin the final dive. So, the tactic changed. Instead of skimming the waves, kamikaze pilots were ordered to climb, to approach from higher altitude, then dive steeply at the last moment, hoping to minimize the time spent inside the invisible field of exploding shells. On paper, it made sense. A high-altitude approach reduced exposure to low-angle anti-aircraft fire. A near-vertical dive increased speed, shrinking the window in which American guns could react. If the aircraft fell fast enough, perhaps even proximity-fused shells would not have time to respond. In practice, the adaptation failed. Climbing higher made the aircraft visible earlier. Radar operators detected the formations at greater range. Fighter direction teams had more time to vector interceptors. Gun crews had more warning, more time to prepare, and more space to build their defensive fire. When the dives began, accuracy collapsed. A kamikaze attack relied on precise timing and alignment. A pilot diving from altitude had seconds to judge speed, angle, and ship movement. American vessels did not hold steady. They turned hard, throwing off aim at the last moment. What little control the pilots retained vanished as gravity took over. Many aircraft missed entirely. Others were hit during the dive itself. Proximity-fused shells burst along the descent path, detonating close enough to shatter wings or kill pilots outright. Even when a plane was not destroyed, fragments often damaged control surfaces just enough to spoil the attack. The result was the worst possible outcome for Japan. Pilots still died. Aircraft were still lost, but fewer ships were hit. The exchange rate collapsed. What had once been a grimly efficient trade, one life for one damaged or sunk ship, became an unsustainable hemorrhage of men and machines for diminishing results. Each tactical adjustment only exposed new weaknesses. By late April, Japanese planners understood the truth they could not escape. They could vary approach angles, they could change altitudes, they could mix conventional attacks with suicide missions, but they could not overcome a defense that reacted automatically, that required no hesitation, and that punished proximity itself. Human adaptation was colliding with mechanical certainty. And still there was one more idea, an attempt to restore inevitability to the kamikaze strike, a weapon designed to remove the pilot's final vulnerability, speed. It would be the most extreme expression of the concept yet. And it would fail for the same reason. If the kamikaze was meant to remove fear from the equation, the Oka was meant to remove doubt. The aircraft was little more than a piloted bomb. Short wings, no landing gear, a warhead packed into the nose, weighing more than a ton. Beneath the fuselage, rocket motors waited for ignition. Once released, the Oka could accelerate to extraordinary speed, far faster than most American fighters, faster than conventional anti-aircraft fire had ever been designed to handle. In its final dive, it was nearly unstoppable, in theory. But the Oka carried a fatal weakness long before it ever reached its target. It could not take off on its own. To reach launch range, it had to be carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. Slow, lightly armored, already infamous among American pilots for its vulnerability. Every Oka attack required the Betty to fly directly into the densest layers of American defense. Radar saw them coming. Fighters intercepted them, and when any broke through, proximity-fused shells finished the work. American gunners did not need to track the Oka itself. They destroyed the bombers carrying them. Entire formations were wiped out before a single piloted bomb could be released. Squadrons vanished without ever entering attack range. On March 21, 1945, one such unit launched with a full complement of Oka aircraft. Not a single one reached launch position. Every bomber was destroyed. The idea of inevitability, of a weapon so fast it could not be stopped, collapsed before it ever reached the fleet. Even when an Oka was released, it faced the same reality as every other kamikaze. Proximity-fused fire filled the dive path with fragments. The margin for survival vanished. Speed no longer guaranteed impact. The Oka was the purest form of the kamikaze concept, a human life fused entirely to a warhead. No escape, no return, no role beyond the moment of impact. And yet, it changed. Nothing. The problem was not bravery. It was not commitment. It was not speed. It was that the sky itself had become hostile long before the target came into view. With the Oka neutralized, Japan had reached the end of its tactical options. There were no new approaches left to try, only the consequences of continuing to send men into a system that had already learned how to kill them efficiently. The kamikaze had always rested on a single, brutal assumption, that a pilot willing to die would almost certainly hit his target. So long as that assumption held, the exchange, one aircraft, one life, one ship, made a terrible kind of sense. It turned Japan's shortage of trained pilots into a weapon. It transformed desperation into a form of precision. By Okinawa, that premise no longer survived contact with reality. Proximity-fused defenses did not need perfect aim. They did not need courage or intuition. They responded automatically, punishing closeness itself. As success rates fell, the logic of sacrifice unraveled. Japanese assessments captured after the battle were blunt. Fewer than 1 in 4 kamikaze aircraft now reached effective attack range. In some sectors, the number was lower still. The losses continued. The results did not. A tactic built on certainty cannot survive probability. Young pilots were still being sent out with promises that their deaths would matter. Increasingly, they did not. Aircraft vanished in the approach. Squadrons failed to reach the fleet at all. Even when damage was inflicted, it no longer approached the level required to change the outcome of the campaign. What had once been a terrifying innovation became a wasting effort. The kamikaze did not fail because American sailors were braver. It failed because the environment it depended on no longer existed. When technology reduced the chance of success below a critical threshold, sacrifice stopped being a weapon. It became only loss. And with that realization, the most extreme tactic of the Pacific War reached its limit, defeated not by will, but by mathematics. When the fighting around Okinawa finally began to subside, the numbers told a grim story. Kamikaze attacks had sunk dozens of American ships and damaged hundreds more. Thousands of sailors were dead. For the U.S. Navy, Okinawa was the bloodiest naval battle of the war. And yet, it could have been far worse. Naval analysts reviewing the campaign reached a sobering conclusion. Without proximity-fused defenses, losses from suicide attacks would have been catastrophic. Entire task groups would have been overwhelmed. The invasion itself might have become untenable. The proximity fuse had not eliminated danger. It had drawn a line between survivable loss and collapse. For American sailors, its impact was intensely personal. Every aircraft destroyed miles from the fleet meant fires that never started, compartments that never flooded, shipmates who never had to fight for their lives in burning steel corridors. The difference between a ship limping away and a ship sinking outright was often decided far out in the sky. For Japan, the meaning was harsher. The kamikaze had been built on faith that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. That resolve could compensate for radar, fighters, and guns. Okinawa shattered that belief. Technology had created a defensive environment where courage no longer translated into effect. Young pilots continued to die long after the outcome was clear. Not because the tactic worked, but because there was nothing left to replace it with. The proximity fuse represented more than a clever invention. It marked a turning point in warfare itself. Weapons no longer relied solely on human judgment at the moment of impact. They began to make decisions on their own, guided by sensors, signals, and probability. In the skies over Okinawa, modern warfare announced itself unmistakably. Human sacrifice had met electronic certainty. And the result was irreversible. When the war ended, no monument was built for the proximity fuse. There were no parades for the factories that produced it, no public ceremonies for the engineers who made it work. Most sailors who trusted their lives to it never even saw what it looked like. They only knew the effect. They knew that some mornings fewer aircraft reached the fleet, that some ships burned but did not sink, that some men went home who otherwise would not have. The story of Okinawa is often told through sacrifice and endurance, but it is also a story about how wars change when technology reaches a point where determination alone is no longer enough. If this is a story you believe is worth remembering, consider liking the video. It helps keep these moments from fading into statistics. And share your thoughts in the comments. Had you heard how the proximity fuse reshaped the battle over Okinawa?